On a Friday morning, George was shot. George didn't survive. I just kept saying, you cannot tell me that the child that I gave birth to is no longer here. Lives are being lost every day. It is a national crisis. I heard Mike Bloomberg speak. He's been in this fight for so long, he heard mothers crying, so he started fighting. When I heard Mike was stepping into the ring, I thought, now we have a dog in the fight. I know Mike is not afraid of the gun lobby. They're scared of him, and they should be. Mike's fighting for every child because you have a right to live. No one has a right to take your hopes and dreams.
I'm Mike Bloomberg, and I approve this message.
Now, the ad was speaking specifically about the shooting of a man named Corey Jones. Corey Jones was a man who was shot and killed by a plainclothes officer. And after the officer shot and killed Jones, the plainclothes officer falsely claimed that he identified himself as a police officer and shot in self-defense. Both claims were disproved by an audio recording of the fatal shooting. And the officer, who, by the way, was a Pakistani-American officer, was charged with and convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, what the ad, of course, doesn't talk about is how rare something like that happens. Of the roughly 7,000 black homicide victims, it is estimated that about 250 of them are killed by the police, were killed by the police. Of that number, the majority of them were resisting with a weapon. And as you know, just because you are unarmed does not mean that you are not dangerous. Michael Brown was unarmed, but his DNA was found on the officer's firearm. The ad did not mention at all the fact that 97% of blacks who are murdered by other blacks, not by cops. When you're looking at the kind of incident that really gets headlines, an unarmed black man killed by a white cop, you're talking about maybe 1% of that 7,000 annual homicide victims who are black. Again, the ad did not even mention how often Americans use guns to defend themselves. Gary Kleck is a criminologist with Florida State University. Here's what he said about the issue.
Professor, you probably are the leading authority on how often Americans use guns to defend themselves. So the question is real simple. How often do Americans use guns to defend themselves every year?
Well, the 2.5 million estimate you referred to before came from a survey I did in 1994 asking people about what they had done in the previous year. So that's a circa 1993 estimate. It's 20 years later. Nobody's published a better survey since then. So I'd really just have to estimate from the 93 estimate to what it would be now. We've got about half the amount of crime that we did back then, so there are half as many occasions for people to use a gun for self-protection. So, you split a 2.5 million in half, and you get about 1.2 million or so. I think that would be a reasonable estimate for this year.
He also said out of that number, 40% believe but for the firearm they would have been dead. Now, the CDC was ordered to do research on how often Americans use guns for defensive purposes. The Obama administration ordered the CDC to do research. And they came back with a study and said, based upon looking at existing research, our conclusion is that there is at least one defensive use of firearms for every one criminal use of it to kill somebody, at least as often. James Q. Wilson is a former professor of public policy at UCLA, the late James Q. Wilson, and I interviewed him about the number of people who use guns for self-defense. Here's what he said.
We know from Census Bureau surveys that something beyond 100,000 uses of guns for self-defense occur every year. We know from smaller surveys of a commercial nature that the number may be as high as 2.5 or 3 million. We don't know what the right number is, but whatever the right number is, it's not a trivial number.
Don't you think that any normal conversation about what kinds of gun control laws we should push for would also include a discussion about how often Americans use guns to defend themselves? You almost never, ever hear it, even on Fox.